So this guy who you have described as a computer geek, Ye Yoon Young, a 32-year-old, he is the guy that, literally goes Breaking Bad behind the scenes to create the Ghost network, which is the latest phone network that has been hacked essentially by law enforcement, and Irish gangs were big users of it. And in particular, we saw raids there in the past few weeks focused on the criminal gang from West Dublin known as the Family. And there have been a number of arrests. And it still is an ongoing investigation, which I think police hope will get to the directors of that grouping. But we'll just call him Young because the name is quite confusing. But this guy who's in Australia, who created it, there's been $9.3 million Australian dollars, which is nearly €6 million in cryptocurrency, and it has been sort of frozen in his bank account. So there's obviously a lot of money in these owl phones.
Yeah, it is, because he's 32 years old.
Yeah.
And he's obviously ran it for, I think it's 10 years. It was set up in 2013.
When he was 22, he set it up?
He set it up, yeah. I mean,
it's an old network.
It's an old network. Like, it was obviously, it's only expanded in recent times, but that's when he started building it.
Oh, yeah.
So,
but he could have been a good few years creating it.
Few years.
Because I don't think they run for long times, these networks.
No. So, I mean, look, obviously he's made that, which is about €6 million in a pretty much in the last 2 or 3 years, I think is what they're talking about, or slightly longer.
And like the takeaway from that ghost story, I thought, was that it was a far smaller operation than EncroChat, where we saw 60,000 mobile phones were linked to that network. Each one of them had been sold, police have said, into a criminal organisation, and each one of them had a sort of an app that had to be attached to the phone for use, that had to be paid for kind of on a monthly rental basis.
Yeah.
Ghost was far smaller.
Yeah, I mean, I think they were talking about 1,000 messages a day, which I suppose that could be as little as like a couple of hundred users, really, if you 5 or 6 messages each. Obviously, some people use them more and some people use them less. So I think they've frozen, and I'm sure we're using the wrong technical terms, like he doesn't have the cryptocurrency in his bank account or whatever, but basically...
It's crypto wallet, I think.
Crypto wallet, yeah. So they've basically seized this money, and it's due to be forfeited to the state straight away. It seems to happen in Australia. But I think you heard, as well, as this has sort of come to court, you can hear a little bit more about how it was operating. A second man has also been charged. He hasn't been named yet, but he was in charge of distributing the phones for this network. So it is alleged he would arrange for these encrypted phones to be delivered to buyers via a dead drop system in exchange for payments. So a dead drop, I think, would be that I'm sure it's more complex than that, but you leave the phone at a certain location. The guy comes along and collects it, and you don't even necessarily meet face to face. That person has been arrested and charged.
And that person was obviously operating in the different countries where these phones were found, because while Australia was the biggest user of these phones, we heard from Assistant Commissioner Justin Kelly of the Garda's Drug and Organised Crime Bureau that Ireland was the second largest user of these phones. So these dead drops were obviously happening somebody was flying halfway across the world to dead drop these phones, or there was a distributor here in this country?
There was a distributor here. I think that's part of the Garda investigation. They described 4 criminal gangs using the phones, but one of those 4, I think, was involved in the distribution,
sale distribution,
and all of that, of these phones in particular. So there's clearly a guy being arrested in Australia, but I'm sure a similar system was being used in Ireland, probably with an agent here.
Isn't it interesting that, globally, there's been this sort of coming together, obviously, of police forces in the takedown of these networks, in the hacking of them. But there seems to be one common goal, and that is to very much publicly go after the creators and the salespeople at the top of it. So they are not, like, from the very first guy who was ever caught up in these, and it was a network that was being run by a guy called Danny Manupasa. He was the focus of the investigation following the discovery of the Enetcom network, which was one of the first. I think that was dating back to 2016, 2017. And he was pretty publicly brought out and before the courts. And these were customized PGP Blackberries, pretty good privacy they were called. And what followed after that, and in particular, if you look at the EncroChat investigation and where it's at 4 years on, in France, we spoke about this recently, the focus is on the creators.
Yeah.
And bringing them to justice, to a hard justice.
Yeah, I mean, I think this has certainly become an increasing focus. I think initially that wasn't the focus, but I think it's being viewed as facilitating crime. You can make an argument that people use, the same standard isn't being held for Google or Facebook or Twitter, where crimes are presumably carried out all the time. But certainly these networks, what they don't have in their defense is, I think it was said during one of the press conferences that almost nobody using the Ghost network, I mean, effectively nobody at all was using it for anything other than organised criminality. It was not being used by people who wanted to have affairs on their wives or do a bit of gambling offside. It was solely for criminality. And that's...
Well, I think what the Australian head of the federal police there said when asked that at the press conference was that they only focused on messages that were kind of centred around criminality, that if there were he was a bit woolly in his answer, but he said if there were messages that weren't involved in criminality, they wouldn't have been interested in them.
Yeah, but however, Europol took another stance and said quite clearly that's what the network was being used for.
Which is what they've said about Encro as well.
Yeah, what they, whether it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but effectively it was said in Europe, anybody using it was using it for those purposes. So the idea, I suppose, that, certainly Twitter or some mega organization like that can say, well, maybe criminality does occur, but we do our best to stamp it out, and we have so many people not using it for those purposes, we can't be held accountable. I think there's a very clear difference with these encrypted networks that have no other purpose other than to allow criminality to exist away from the law enforcement's eyes.
And like any of these network takedowns, like Encro and like Anon and Enetcom, even before it, these stories will continue to come and surface, and we need to wait to see if the encrypted messages that were used, certainly here in Ireland, by groupings that have been brought before the courts and will be brought before the courts, are going to be used in evidence, because we believe it'll be the first time the Irish courts have heard this sort of encrypted messaging as part of a case against somebody. Of course, last month, the Ghost network was busted in a number of countries. There was a big press conference, both in The Hague and here in Dublin, and we were told that 11 people had been arrested by Gardaí, 16 million euro worth of drugs, mostly cocaine, was seized as well, but that was level one of the investigation. That was that sort of, primary. There's been a build up to that point when 300 specialist Gardaí targeted the 4 gangs based here. The next level will be the deeper dive into those gangs, into those messages, and the focus will be on trying to bring the top tier level members of these gangs before the courts, and likely the special criminal in the coming month and possibly year, because these stories take a long time. I mean, we're still every day seeing EncroChat stuff come before the courts. It's still a big story. April 2020 was when the hack started, and I think by the summer of that year, the story began to break, and we started to begin to get a little bit of an information into what was happening. And then, of course, there was a huge big press conference attended by police forces across Europe, where it was explained. And what we then saw over the forthcoming years was the court cases, the guilty pleas, they have trials.
I mean, the first and most, probably the primary thing they have to do is to match the handle or the nickname that the person uses on these encrypted devices, because nobody's going to use their name. They have to be matched to an individual, and that has to be proven and provable. So, you have to then use various things like location devices, but also in a lot of cases in EncroChat they used images, background taken, birthdays, things like that. I think you've heard again in this Ghost network, which is very similar to EncroChat, you're starting to hear how they actually hacked in. And again, it seems to have been that they hijacked onto one of these updates that people received where, they regularly updated. The Ghost network was regularly updated with these security updates. So people used to getting on their phones and you click, do you accept this update? And
Yes.
you clicked in yes.
Many times I click that all
the time.
Yeah.
And it seems that the police infected the devices through one of these updates somehow again. Again, we're not hearing all of it, but that seems to have been the way. And then they began to monitor communications then over that point.
Yeah.
How long that exactly went on for, it again isn't clear, but again, it's probably a number of months. So we'll see it. And
Young is kind of a classic sort of creator that we're finding more and more behind these networks and this sort of technology that's used by criminality. He's described as a computer geek, and he, was sort of the perfect son, a quiet guy, kept to himself, a bit of a loner, probably highly intelligent, obviously, that he's able to create this kind of a thing. He was running the Ghost Network while continuing to work for his parents' commercial cleaning business, which was located in Sydney. And he was polite and the perfect son, apparently. But of course, there's always this temptation for these people to be drawn into criminality. The skills of the technical genius is as wanted in the illegitimate world as it is in the legitimate world, and as useful, in fact, more.
Yeah, look, we've seen a few cases in Ireland of people that were involved in dark web sites, one of them in particular serving a very lengthy sentence in the US. Guys that would never have become associated with criminality in the normal course of events, that are, computer geeks, I suppose. But there's something else going on, I suppose. It's a bit of greed, maybe. Maybe it's a look for a bit of a thrill to have an edge into that world. I think in this case, happening in 2024, the idea that Mr. Young there wouldn't have known what the consequences were is very hard to accept. Even if he'd edged himself into this circumstance, he kept going right up until the end.
I found one of the most interesting stories in this, apart obviously from our own, the family network, being caught up in it, was the Italian on the run mafia don, Giovanni Parlanghelli. Was there any update on that, or has the reportage out of Italy gone dark? I mean, it is only one person in one of the biggest countries in Europe.
There has been a bit of reporting on it, but not a lot, I think. Like in our own case, there's an initial arrest, and then there's we'll hear more as things come to trial. But certainly it seems that he's a member of what's called the Fourth Mafia in Italy, a much lesser known organisation, but it certainly seems to have had a lot of strength in Albania and on that border between Italy and Albania. And Albania has been a transit point, certainly for the movement of drugs around the world since the collapse of the communist regime in Albania, at the end of or beginning of the 1990s. It's become one of those hubs, just like other parts in Central America have become. Certainly the initial reporting was linking him to that sort of...
Sacra Corona Unita, I think is the name of the mafia.
Sacra Corona Unita, yeah, which are the fourth mafia after the other main ones. But they seem to have been heavily involved in the distribution of drugs.
And moving the drugs into Central Europe. And is there a suggestion that he, on this Ghost network, is supplying or helping the distribution of the supply of the drugs into the family?
Well, there's no particular suggestion, however.
He just seems like an outlier out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have people that specialise in these kind of distribution points, I mean, we know from the family.
Why else is he on the Ghost network? Because obviously you need to be coupled with other Ghost phones for it to be of any value.
Well, we do know, look, this is what we do know about the family, that they had a different route, I suppose, for some of their drugs than the Kinahan network. They had close ties to Turkish mafias, both in the UK and in Central Europe. Those Turkish mafias traditionally were in charge of smuggling heroin from Afghanistan through Iran into Turkey. Then they brought those drugs down into Albania and places like that before distributing across Europe. The family were in particular linked to one major heroin seizure in Germany before. And that, those Turkish mafias, while they initially made their money through heroin, they also moved into cannabis and then ultimately into cocaine as well. As the cocaine boom went on, we saw that the Eastern European gangs played a huge role in the logistical movement of cocaine from South America. That the ports in Central or in Eastern Europe were also used as a landing point and then as a distribution point, where they would have hauliers then move it across Europe. So we don't know exactly, and maybe that'll form part of the case. But it seems not illogical to believe that the Italian mafioso guy was involved in the distribution. That's certainly what's said in the charge, but it's not corrected or connected directly to Ireland at this point anyway.
The while the family grouping have international connections, they have very much been home birds, haven't they? Which is ultimately going to result in their downfall, because you see a kind of a dismantling like this in a global getting together of Garda and police forces. This would have been useful intelligence-wise, but at the same time, only part of a process had they been located abroad.
Yeah.
They always stayed home, the family unit. They're an easier dismantling, while I'm sure any of the cops working on the case would want to flatten me for saying they're easier, but they have to be. It has to be an easier end than the likes of the Kinahans, who are just so far away, so out of reach, operating completely, directing everything on phones. And, then you have that whole political cesspit, which is obviously the United Arab Emirates, to try and deal with and try and get them back.
Yeah, I mean, what you'd say in terms of the family organisation that have made them so difficult to penetrate is that it has been a very tight organisation with a number of key figures that have seemed to have this total trust in each other. That doesn't seem to be breakable. There haven't been splits or divides of that type. Beyond that leadership group, they've often preyed on people that are far below them, if you know what I mean. People that suffer from addiction, to use them to store things. And they've seemed to been able to keep a tighter rein on that. Also, if you look at Daniel Kinahan, he's currently, as we know from court proceedings, wanted in connection with the murder of Eddie Hutch, because the Kinahans, at least in part, some of the attention has been brought on by the fact that they became involved in so many murders. The family certainly have stayed much further away from that, because ultimately a lot of the criminals in this country have been brought down as a result of the murders they've committed rather than the drugs they've dealt. So that's how that organisation has stayed so strong, both its unity and the fact that they haven't seemed to have got involved in these sort of killings just for over honour and disrespect, or whatever you might call it. But yeah, it's certainly, there is a belief and a hope that the three leaders of that family gang would be directly implicated in these messages.
Now, are you sorry you didn't stay in computers?
Not really. Why? So I could be sharing
So I could call you a computer geek while writing about you, if you had gone Breaking Bad yourself.
If you look at that in the article that we wrote, we have it.
We didn't.
As an organisation that
you're just taking cover in your organisation now.
However, if you see it's in what used to be called blips in the business, it's in quotation marks.
Yes, you can get away with anything if you put quotation marks.
No.
Said it.
Because one is quoting from the Australian media, nonetheless, ABC News Australia,
You're
who referred to him as a computer geek.
I'm kicking it on.
And I meant,
You're slightly changing the subject. You started out life as a computer geek yourself.
Well, I mean, however poor I am in the journalistic field, I was really, really bad in the computer geek field.
Were you?
Yeah. It wasn't for me.
Like, how bad? Were you in IT or something like that?
I wasn't in IT. I wasn't one of the people that you harassed, how do you turn on my computer? I was briefly a computer sort of programmer. Massively unsuccessful.
Were you?
Yeah, massively unsuccessful.
Yeah. To the extent that you had to leave the entire employment.
Well, I don't even know if I made
career.
I don't know if that choice was arguably made for me.
Many years did you do at it?
Look, less than 2, but it wasn't for me, yeah.
And how many years did you study for it?
Well, I mean, I sort of
These were your dark years, were
I
they?
sort of rambled through stuff and eventually came out with something.
If you'd have been any good, I'd say during those years you would have ended up here on my screen in front of me
Exactly.
in a mugshot.
It all worked out well, didn't
It all worked out well. Right, I'll leave you alone now.
Thanks, Nicola.
Thanks, Niall. I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.